Hi there. This is a quick video demonstration of the SQL Server Management Studio, which is the application that you'll use to interact with SQL Server databases. As you remember from our class discussion, SQL Server is organized as a client-server system, which means that the database itself and its data are stored on a database server. The database server is actually software that runs on any computer that you, as the client, can connect to, either directly or through a network. In our work for this class, the server will actually be running on our individual client machines, but it could just as well be running on one that was across the world somewhere. SQL Server Management Studio is the client side of the client-server system, which means that it too is software, but it must always run on our client machine and is the tool that we use to manipulate the database itself. It's not the database, it's just our interface to the database. Management Studio is run on from the Program Start menu, just like any other program. On our lab machines, you'll find it listed under Microsoft SQL Server 2008 R2. After running the Management Studio program, you'll see this dialog box in the center of the screen that allows us to connect to the database server. Clicking the Connect button connects us to the server, not to a database. Okay, once it's connected to the server, we see the Management Studio window and a pane inside it called the Object Explorer. The Object Explorer pane contains, among other things, a folder called Databases. A database server typically stores more than one database, and so we have a folder that contains any that happen to be installed on that machine. If I expand that folder by clicking the plus sign, then I will see all the databases that are available for me to select from on this server. So we see several databases here, one of which is the accounts payable database that we discussed briefly in class. It's called AP. If I expand the AP folder, then we begin to see the structure of the AP database. And we see a number of objects here, one of which is a folder that contains all of the tables in the AP database. If I expand that folder, then I see a listing of the tables that are available there. And so we recognize from having seen this before, we recognize the vendors table, we recognize the invoices table, the invoice line items table, and so forth. If I expand one of these table definitions by clicking the plus sign, let's select invoices, then I will see the columns or the attributes, the data elements associated with that table. If I expand that folder, then I see the individual data elements that are part of that folder. I'm going to move it out so we can see it a little better. And so here we see the individual data elements, and we see the primary key represented by a gold key symbol, which is the invoice ID for the invoices table. And then we see foreign keys represented by silver, I guess, or blue key symbols. And these are primary keys to other tables for which we have a relationship between invoices and the other table. So for instance, the vendors table is related to the invoices table, and the vendor ID is included in the invoices table as a foreign key. And then of course we have the other data elements that are associated with the invoices table. And notice that once we have expanded the columns folder, we can no longer expand any of these other elements. They've been expanded to the maximum extent that we can. And we still haven't seen any actual data. We've just seen the structure of the tables. Now, in order to work with the actual data stored in the tables, we first have to retrieve the data from the tables using what's called a database query. And a query is a small program that we write to tell the server what data we want to retrieve and from which tables in a database that resides on this server. So if we want to look at the actual data, then we have to write a query. To begin to write a query, the first thing we have to do is make sure that the database that SQL Server knows which database we want to retrieve data from. Let me close this window, or shrink it a little bit so that we have room to work. And I'm going to start by clicking on the New Query button here, and that will open up a couple of other panes which will allow us to create a query. The middle pane here is the query editor window in which I'm going to write my query, and then over on the right I have a properties window that I don't really need to worry about right at this time. But as I said, in order to begin to write a query, we have to be sure that that SQL Server knows which database we want to reference in our query. So up here is the available databases window. If you hover your mouse over it, you'll see it's called available databases. Right now it's set for master, but that's not the database we want to use. So I click the drop down menu, open it up, and I have to select the AP database because that's the one that I'm going to write the query against. Now that will ensure that any statements that I write in the query window will execute against the AP database. If I fail to do that and I write a query, then most likely I won't get any. I'll get error messages because SQL Server doesn't know where to retrieve the data. So this is how I get started. I click the New Query button to open up a query editor window. I select the proper database that I want to use, and now I write the query. Just as an example, I'm going to write a quick query to select information from the invoices table. So I'm going to write a statement that says select, and then I need to tell it which data elements I want it to select. Now I can either type these in just a line separating each one by a comma, or I can drag them from the Object Explorer window over here and just drop them in, which is the easiest and most error-free way to do it. So I'm going to pick the invoice ID as my first element, and then I'm going to type a comma, a space. Now I'm going to select the invoice total. This is the amount of the invoice, and I'm going to take one more item, which would be the invoice due date. And now I've selected 3 data elements, and now I need to tell it from which table do I want to retrieve these. So I'm going to say from, and then I want it from the invoices table, so I'm just going to drag that table name and drop it into the query. Now I'm going to execute that query, and I could do it by pressing the F5 key or by pressing the execute button here. When I do that, the query is run, and you can see in the results window down here under the results tab, I have those 3 items of data from every record, every entry in the invoices table. There are a lot of other things that I can do with this. For instance, let's say that I don't want to see every record. Maybe I only want to see the records where the invoice total is more than $1,000, or say $10,000. To do that, I say where invoice total is greater than or equal to 10,000, and execute that. And now I see I get 6 records back, all of which have total amounts of $10,000 or more. So that's just an example of what a query looks like. It's very English-like. You can see here, you can just read it. You can say select these 3 items from the invoices table where the invoice total is greater than or equal to 10,000. It's very easy to understand. These are very simple programming statements to learn to write. We're not doing that right now. We're just demonstrating it. But that will be in follow-on lessons. We'll learn how to do that. Then, lastly, we might want to save this query so that we can use it again. So we do it in the usual way. There's a save button here. There is a save as command that you can select to give it a name. So it operates just like every other Microsoft program that you've used, Microsoft Word or any of those. So it's very simple to do most of the things that you're used to doing. So that's a brief orientation to the Management Studio and the Query Editor. And you're going to learn a lot more about them as we use them in the next few weeks. So from here, we're going to begin to explore query writing in more depth and learn to use the SQL syntax, and then this will give you the tools that you need to really use a database. So thanks for listening.